What if I told you that behind some of history's greatest fortunes lies a secret so dark it was deliberately erased from memory? Imagine a world where unimaginable wealth was built on unthinkable suffering, where the most elegant women in society lived in golden cages of their own making. In the 18th century, a single sugar plantation in Jamaica generated more profit than the entire GDP of most European nations. But behind every fortune, there were the women, beautiful, educated, who knew exactly where that blood money came from. These weren't just wealthy wives. They were the queens of an empire built on human misery, living in mansions that were essentially monuments to slavery. We're pulling back the silk curtains to reveal the untold stories of the forgotten wives of the sugar barons. Before we dive into this fascinating yet dark chapter of history together, I'd love it if you could show some love for tonight's story. If you're already feeling intrigued, go ahead and hit that like button. It really helps me bring you more of these deep dive historical tales. If you're new here and enjoy stories that uncover the hidden truths behind history's glamorous facade, that subscribe button is calling your name. I'm genuinely curious. Where are you watching from tonight? And let me know what time it is where you are. There's something magical about knowing we're all scattered across the world, but sharing this moment together. Maybe grab a warm drink, and let's step into a world of silken shadows. A gilded world. Imagine walking through the grand estates of 18th century England. You're strolling past manicured gardens that cost more to maintain than most people earned in a lifetime. The air is sweet with the scent of imported flowers. And in the distance, you can hear the gentle clinking of fine china from an afternoon tea party. Everything seems perfect, almost ethereal in its beauty. But here's what's unsettling, and this is where our story really begins. Every single luxury you see, every silk dress rustling in the breeze, every golden chandelier casting dancing shadows on marble floors, was purchased with what we recognize today as blood money. The women hosting these elegant gatherings, discussing the latest fashions from Paris and the newest novels from London, were living off profits from sugar plantations where human beings were worked to death. Let me paint you a picture of Elizabeth Beckford, wife of William Beckford, one of the wealthiest men in 18th century Britain. Elizabeth lived in Fonthill Abbey, a mansion so extravagant that its construction costs would equal about $400 million today. She wore gowns that cost more than a middle-class family's annual income, and her jewelry collection was legendary throughout London society. But here's the thing that sends chills down your spine. Elizabeth knew with crystal clarity that her husband owned 14 sugar plantations in Jamaica where over 3,000 enslaved people toiled under conditions that the average life expectancy was just 7 years after arrival from Africa. She knew that for every pound of sugar that graced her tea table, someone had suffered unimaginably, and yet she hosted lavish parties where the very sugar that sweetened their desserts carried the taste of human tears. What's fascinating and deeply disturbing is how these women constructed elaborate mental barriers to cope with this reality. They developed what historians call willful blindness, a psychological defense mechanism where they acknowledge the source of their wealth in abstract terms while completely disconnecting from its human cost. Wife of sugar baron Thomas Hibbert, her personal diary, discovered in the 1990s, reveals the extraordinary mental gymnastics these women performed. She wrote extensively about her concerns for the poorest souls in Africa, while simultaneously recording detailed accounts of purchasing new enslaved people for their plantations as casually as she might note buying new horses. In one particularly chilling entry from 1784, Margaret describes hosting a charity event to raise money for the unfortunate, while wearing a necklace worth £50,000, money that came directly from plantation profits. The cognitive dissonance is staggering. These women genuinely saw themselves as charitable Christian ladies of virtue, while living off the most brutal system of human exploitation in history. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of their lives was the elaborate social code they developed to maintain their sanity in London's high society. There were unwritten rules about what could and couldn't be discussed. You could talk about the weather in Jamaica, the challenges of shipping, even the profitability of different crops, but you never ever spoke about the actual people whose lives were being consumed to generate that profit, whose husband owned 7 plantations across the Caribbean, became infamous for her sugar parties, elaborate fairs where everything was themed around sweetness and luxury. Guests would feast on imported delicacies, while musicians played cheerful melodies. The irony was lost on no one, yet no one dared speak it aloud. It was as if the entire social class had agreed to participate in a collective delusion. What makes this story even more complex is that many of these women were genuinely intelligent, educated, and by the standards of their time, progressive. They supported women's education, funded orphanages, and championed various social causes. Yet they remained completely blind to the suffering that funded their philanthropy. The psychological toll of this lifestyle was immense. Historical records show unusually high rates of what we now recognize as anxiety and depression among sugar wives. Many turned to laudanum, liquid opium, to cope with what their diaries describe as inexplicable melancholy and persistent nightmares. Some modern historians argue that their subconscious minds were rebelling against the moral compromise their conscious minds had accepted. Dr. Rebecca Holmes, a historian at Oxford who has spent decades studying these women, notes that their letters and diaries reveal a pattern of what she calls moments when their moral compass would briefly pierce through the elaborate justifications they constructed. These women would sometimes write about feeling undeserving of their wealth or experiencing strange dreams about dark faces calling out to them. The most tragic irony is that many of these women genuinely believed they were living moral lives. They attended church regularly, read scripture, and considered themselves good Christians. They convinced themselves that their wealth was a blessing from God, and their comfortable lives were simply part of divine providence. The mental architecture they built to maintain this belief system was as elaborate and impressive as their physical mansions. As we peel back the layers of this gilded world, we begin to see how an entire class of people, some of the most privileged women in human history, became willing participants in a system of unimaginable cruelty, all while maintaining the fiction that they were living virtuous, meaningful lives. And this is just the beginning of our exploration, because as we'll discover, some of these women eventually began to question the foundations of their golden cages. Some would become rebels, others would sink deeper into denial, and a few would pay prices that would shock even their contemporaries. We're going to dive into something that will absolutely blow your mind. How these marriages weren't love stories at all, but carefully orchestrated business mergers designed to create sugar empires that would dominate global commerce. We'll meet women who were literally bought and sold like commodities, whose dowries and bloodlines were calculated with the same precision used to value plantation equipment. The stories you're about to hear will change how you think about marriage, money, and power forever. The business of marriage. We've seen how these women lived in their golden cages. But now comes the truly shocking part, how they got there in the first place. Because what I'm about to tell you will completely shatter any romantic notions you might have about 18th century marriages among the wealthy. These weren't fairy tale love stories. Calculated business transactions that would make modern corporate mergers look like casual handshake deals. Picture this scene from 1752. 16-year-old Catherine Codrington sits in her father's drawing room in Bristol. She's wearing her finest dress, her hands folded neatly in her lap, as two men discuss her future, as if she were a prize racehorse. One is her father, a textile merchant looking to climb the social ladder. The other is Richard Beckford, not the William we met earlier, but his cousin, who owns 6 sugar plantations in Barbados, and is worth what would be about $2 billion today. But here's the kicker. Catherine isn't just being introduced to her future husband. She's being appraised. Richard examines her teeth to ensure she's healthy enough. He asks detailed questions about her family's medical history, their bloodlines, and most importantly, her dowry. Because in this world, marriage wasn't about love. It was about creating sugar dynasties that would last for generations. The numbers behind these marriages are absolutely staggering. Catherine's dowry was £15,000, roughly £3 million in today's money. But that was just the entry fee. Her family also promised to invest an additional £20,000 in Richard's plantation operations and provide ongoing financial support for expansion. In return, Catherine would receive an annual allowance that made her one of the wealthiest women in England, along with properties in London, Bath, and Jamaica. It gets even more calculated than that. These families maintain what they call bloodline registers, detailed genealogical records that track not just family trees, but the financial performance of each branch. They knew exactly which family combinations had produced the most successful plantation dynasties, and which marriages had led to financial disasters. Let me tell you about the Lascelles family, perhaps the most strategic marriage architects of the sugar world. Henry Lascelles, who built what became one of Britain's largest sugar fortunes, didn't just arrange marriages for love or even just for money. He engineered them like a chess grandmaster, planning 20 moves ahead. In 1761, Henry arranged for his daughter and to marry into the Harewood family, while simultaneously planning for his son Daniel to wed a plantation heiress from Antigua. But here's the brilliant and chilling part. These marriages were timed to coincide with expansion plans across 3 different Caribbean islands. Each wedding essentially represented the merger of not just families, but entire economic empires. The wedding contracts from this era read like modern-day merger agreements. They specify not just dowries and inheritance rights, but detailed provisions about plantation management, slave purchasing quotas, and profit-sharing arrangements. One contract I found in the British archives actually includes a clause requiring the bride to personally oversee the proper management of estate property, a euphemism for supervising enslaved people, for at least 6 months per year. What's particularly heartbreaking is reading the personal letters these young women wrote. Take 17-year-old Eleanor Pennant, whose marriage to sugar Baron John Pennant was arranged in 1765. In letters to her sister, she writes about feeling like a commodity being prepared for market and describes her pre-wedding preparations as training for a business venture I never chose to enter. Eleanor's training was extensive and disturbing. She spent months learning to read plantation account books, studying the proper management of enslaved workers, and memorizing the legal codes that govern plantation operations. She was essentially being educated to become a business partner in human trafficking, all while being told she was being prepared for a life of luxury and privilege. The wedding ceremonies themselves were elaborate displays of sugar wealth that would put modern billionaire weddings to shame. When Lassells married into the Harewood family, the celebration lasted 3 weeks and cost the equivalent of $50 million today. The wedding cake alone required 500 pounds of sugar that represented the labor of hundreds of enslaved people working under brutal conditions thousands of miles away. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of these marriage arrangements was the breeding clauses. Yes, you heard that right. Many contracts included specific provisions about producing heirs, with financial penalties if the marriages didn't produce children within certain time frames. These women weren't just wives. They were expected to be baby-making machines for continuing sugar dynasties. The pressure was immense. Who married plantation owner Thomas Lewis in 1773, wrote in her diary about the monthly anxiety of potentially disappointing her husband and in-laws if she failed to conceive. When she did become pregnant, her letters reveal that she was more concerned about producing a male heir to inherit the plantations than she was about her own health or well-being. Some of these arrangements were so cold-blooded, they're almost hard to believe. The marriage contract between Isabella Fletcher and sugar baron James Dawkins included a clause stating that if Isabella died in childbirth, her dowry would remain with the Dawkins family. But if James died first, Isabella would only inherit a small annual allowance, not his plantation wealth. She was essentially signing her own financial death warrant, while being told it was the opportunity of a lifetime. What's fascinating is how these families justified these arrangements to themselves and their daughters. They developed an elaborate mythology around sugar royalty, the idea that plantation families were a new form of aristocracy, blessed by providence and destined to rule over vast empires. Young women were told they were being elevated to positions of almost divine authority, when in reality, they were being enlisted as officers in a system of human exploitation. The geographic logistics of these marriages were mind-boggling. Families would arrange matches between people who had never met, living thousands of miles apart. Isabella Hibbert was engaged to a man in Jamaica while living in Yorkshire, based entirely on financial projections and bloodline analysis. Their first meeting was on their wedding day, after Isabella had endured a 6-week sea voyage during which she had plenty of time to contemplate the fact that she was sailing toward a life built on the suffering of people she would soon own. The most tragic irony is that many of these strategic marriages actually worked. At least, the sugar dynasties they created generated wealth that lasted for centuries. Some of these families became so powerful that they essentially controlled entire islands in the Caribbean and wielded enormous influence in British politics for generations. But the human cost was devastating, not just for the enslaved people who suffered under their system, but for the women who were essentially purchased to perpetuate it. They became willing participants in their own commodification, trading their freedom and autonomy for material comfort and social status. As we'll discover in our next chapter, once these women arrived at their plantation kingdoms, they faced a reality that no amount of strategic planning could have prepared them for. They would have to navigate the day-to-day reality of living in a paradise built on hell, managing households that were essentially small cities powered by human misery, all while maintaining the fiction that they were living blessed, virtuous lives. The psychological toll of this existence would push some of them to extraordinary acts of cruelty while driving others toward madness. The reality of paradise. Let's step to the looking glass and enter the actual world these women inhabited once they arrived at their Caribbean kingdoms. What awaited them was a reality so surreal, so morally twisted that it reads like something from a fever dream, except it was their daily life for decades. Imagine stepping off a ship after 6 weeks at sea, your corset still tight, despite the sweltering heat, and being greeted by what can only be described as a living contradiction. You see a mansion that rivals anything in Europe, marble columns imported from Italy, crystal chandeliers from France, gardens designed by the finest landscape architects money could buy. On the other side, you see rows upon rows of wooden barracks where hundreds of human beings live in conditions that would make a medieval dungeon seem luxurious. This was the daily reality for someone like Charlotte Palmer, who arrived at her husband's estate in Antigua in 1778. Her first letter home to her sister in England captures the psychological whiplash. The house is more magnificent than anything I could have imagined, yet I cannot escape the sound of chains and cries that echo from the quarters each dawn. It is as if God and the devil had conspired to build their respective kingdoms side by side. Let me paint you a picture of what a typical day looked like for these plantation mistresses, because it's unlike anything you've ever imagined. Charlotte would wake at sunrise in a bedroom that cost more to furnish than most people earned in a lifetime. She'd ring a silver bell, made, ironically, from silver mined by enslaved people in South America, and within moments, half a dozen enslaved women would appear to dress her, style her hair, and prepare her breakfast. But here's where it gets psychologically twisted. While being pampered like royalty, Charlotte was simultaneously functioning as the overseer of a massive operation built. Her morning routine included reviewing what plantation records euphemistically called disciplinary reports, detailed accounts of which enslaved people had been whipped, branded, or worse for perceived infractions like working too slowly or speaking their native languages. The level of luxury these women enjoyed is almost impossible to comprehend by modern standards. Take the wardrobe inventory from Rose Price's estate in Jamaica. Discovered in a trunk in 1987, she owned 147 silk gowns, 89 pairs of shoes made from materials ranging from Italian leather to crocodile skin, and jewelry worth approximately $40 million in today's money. She had a personal staff of 12 people whose sole job was maintaining her appearance and managing her social calendar. Rose's daily schedule also included what she called estate management meetings, sessions where she would review punishment logs, approve the purchase of new enslaved people, and make decisions about separating families when plantation labor needs changed. Her diary entries switched seamlessly between complaints about a dress not fitting properly and casual notes about authorizing the sale of children away from their mothers. The mental compartmentalization required to maintain this lifestyle, these women developed elaborate daily rituals that allowed them to psychologically separate their luxury from its source. Maria Beckford, yet another member of this vast sugar dynasty, would spend her mornings in what she called paradise hour, walking through ornate gardens while enslaved people worked the cane fields just beyond her view. She wrote about feeling transported by the beauty of creation, while literally living off the destruction of human lives. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of their daily existence was how they rationalized their role in the system. These weren't passive beneficiaries. They were active managers. When Eleanor Long inherited her husband's plantation in 1782, she didn't just maintain the status quo. She implemented what she called efficiency improvements that increased sugar production by 40% while simultaneously reducing the life expectancy of workers by an estimated 2 years. Eleanor's personal papers reveal the twisted logic these women used to justify their actions. She wrote extensively about her maternal responsibility toward the enslaved people on her plantation, describing brutal punishments as necessary corrections and family separations as strategic workforce management. She wasn't a cruel oppressor. She was a firm but fair mother figure managing wayward children. The social dynamics within these plantation mansions were equally complex and disturbing. These women lived surrounded by enslaved people who attended to their every need. Yet they maintained elaborate pretenses about the nature of these relationships. Many plantation mistresses wrote about their favorite enslaved women as if they were beloved friends, completely ignoring the fact that these relationships were built on absolute power and the constant threat of violence. Consider the diary of Inbaram, who managed a plantation in Jamaica while her husband conducted business in London. She wrote affectionately about an enslaved woman named Celia, describing her as my dearest companion and the most loyal friend a woman could wish for. The same diary includes entries about punishing Celia for minor infractions and refusing to allow her to visit her children, who had been sold to a neighboring plantation. The entertainment these women organized reveals just how completely they had normalized the abnormal. Plantation parties were legendary for their extravagance. Imagine dinner parties where guests dine on delicacies imported from around the world, served by people who were literally owned by their hosts. The contrast between the elegant conversation about philosophy and literature happening at the table and the brutal reality of how that luxury was funded was lost on no one. No one dared acknowledge it. Isabella Phillips threw what she called harvest celebrations, elaborate parties timed to coincide with sugarcane harvests. Guests would feast and dance while enslaved people worked 20-hour days cutting cane in conditions so brutal that many collapsed from exhaustion. The parties lasted for days, while the harvest season often claimed dozens of lives from overwork and heat stroke. The psychological toll of maintaining these contradictions. Many develop what we now recognize as dissociative behaviors, the ability to completely disconnect from reality when it became too uncomfortable to bear. Margaret Pinnock wrote about experiencing strange episodes where she would find herself standing in the plantation quarters with no memory of how she got there, as if her subconscious mind was forcing her to confront what her conscious mind refused to acknowledge. Sleep disturbances were common among plantation mistresses. Night terrors, insomnia, and what they described as disturbing dreams of dark figures plagued many of these women. Dr. Sarah Williams, a modern psychologist who has studied historical trauma patterns, suggests that these symptoms were likely manifestations of what we now call moral injury, the psychological damage that occurs when someone participates in acts that violate their fundamental moral beliefs. Yet perhaps the most tragic aspect of their daily existence was how completely they had convinced themselves that they were living virtuous lives. Many of these women were genuinely religious, hosting prayer meetings and Bible studies in their plantation houses. They would read passages about Christian charity and compassion while sitting in rooms decorated with artwork purchased using profits from human bondage. The cognitive dissonance reached its peak during what they called spiritual reflection time, periods when plantation mistresses would contemplate their place in God's plan while enslaved people labored outside their windows. They developed elaborate theological justifications for slavery, convincing themselves that they were actually saving souls by bringing Africans to Christian lands, even as they worked those same people to death. As we peel back these layers of their daily existence, we begin to see how an entire class of women became willing participants in a system of unimaginable cruelty, while maintaining the fiction that they were living blessed, meaningful lives. But what we haven't yet explored is perhaps the most shocking element of all, the actual mechanics of how their vast wealth was generated and the specific human cost of every luxury they enjoyed. Because when you understand the true arithmetic of suffering that funded their paradise, you'll never look at historical wealth the same way again. The arithmetic of atrocity. What I'm about to reveal to you will fundamentally change how you understand wealth and privilege. Because behind every silk dress, every diamond necklace, every crystal chandelier in these women's lives was a precise mathematical equation of human suffering that would make your blood run cold. Let me break down the actual numbers for you. Because when you see the arithmetic of atrocity that funded their lifestyle, you'll understand why these secrets were so carefully guarded. In 1785, a single pound of sugar required approximately 1.2 hours of enslaved labor under conditions so brutal that the mortality rate was 8% annually, meaning 1 in 12 people died every year just to keep the sugar flowing. Here's where it gets truly shocking. Lady Catherine Codrington, who we met earlier, consumed approximately 400 pounds of sugar annually in her household, but for preserves, confections, and elaborate desserts that grace her dinner parties. That means her personal sugar consumption alone required 480 hours of enslaved labor each year. That's the equivalent of one person working full-time for 3 months just to satisfy her sweet tooth. But sugar was just the beginning. The true horror lies in what historians call the triangle of terror, the interconnected web of slavery, sugar, and global commerce that these women's wealth depended on. Let me walk you through exactly how this worked, because most people have no idea how vast and systematic this operation really was. Ships would leave English ports loaded with manufactured goods, textiles, weapons, rum, and iron goods. These weren't random cargo choices. They were specifically selected items that African slave traders wanted in exchange for human beings. A single musket, costing about 50 pounds to manufacture in Birmingham, could be traded for 3 people on the African coast. The profit margin was approximately 2,000%. The Middle Passage, that horrific journey across the Atlantic, was where the real calculations became monstrous. Ship captains like John Newton, who later wrote Amazing Grace, as an act of repentance, kept detailed logs that read like livestock manifests. A ship carrying 400 people would expect to lose 60 to 80 during the crossing, a mortality rate of 15% to 20% that was simply built into the business model. When ships arrived in the Caribbean, the surviving people were sold at markets that operated exactly like modern commodity exchanges. The Royal African Company's records, preserved in the British National Archives, show that in 1750, the average selling price was £35 per person, roughly $7,000 in today's money. But here's the truly chilling part. Plantation owners calculated that each person would generate approximately £200 of profit before death, which typically occurred within 7 years. This means that someone like Margaret Pinnock, whose plantation we discussed earlier, was essentially running a death machine that consumed human lives at a predictable rate. Her personal records show that between 1760 and 1780, her plantation processed, and I use that word deliberately, over 2,200 people. The average life expectancy on her estate was 6.3 years after arrival. But what makes this story even more disturbing is how these women tracked and optimized this human consumption. They kept detailed ledgers that would make modern efficiency experts proud. Mary Long's plantation records, discovered in Jamaica in 1995, include charts tracking workforce replacement rates. She literally calculated the most efficient ways to work people to death. The wealth generated by this system was astronomical. A single plantation like the one owned by Elizabeth Beckford could generate annual profits of £40,000. That's roughly £8 million in today's money. Over her lifetime, Elizabeth's personal wealth accumulation from plantation profits exceeded what would be $300 million today. To put this in perspective, Elizabeth's annual income from sugar was larger than the GDP of most European cities at the time. She was quite literally one of the wealthiest people in human history. And every penny of that wealth came from a system that consumed human lives like fuel. The logistics of maintaining this wealth machine required incredible coordination. These women weren't passive recipients of blood money. They were active managers of global supply chains built on human trafficking. And Lascelles maintained correspondence with ship captains, slave traders, and plantation managers across 3 continents. Her personal papers include detailed instructions about cargo quality, transport efficiency, and replacement scheduling. In one particularly chilling letter from 1772, and writes to a slave trader in Liverpool, the last shipment included too many elderly specimens. Future consignment should prioritize youth and physical capacity, as our operational efficiency depends upon maximum productivity before inevitable replacement becomes necessary. Think about the cold calculation in that language. Specimens, replacement, operational efficiency. She's discussing human beings, like they were machinery with predictable failure rates. The financial instruments these women used to manage their wealth were equally sophisticated and horrifying. They pioneered what we now recognize as futures contracts, insurance policies, and investment portfolios, all based on human bondage. Isabella Price took out insurance policies on the people she owned, collecting payouts when they died, which actually created a perverse incentive to work them harder, since dead people generated immediate cash, while living people only produced long-term profits. The banking systems that supported this wealth were extensive. Families like the Barclays, whose bank still exists today, built their early fortunes by providing loans secured by human collateral. A typical loan contract would specify how many enslaved people were being used as security, their estimated productive value, and replacement schedules if the collateral died. What's perhaps most shocking is how normal all of this seemed to these women. Their letters and diaries discuss buying and selling human beings with the same casual tone they used to discuss purchasing horses or redecorating their parlors. Sarah Dawkins wrote to her sister about acquiring 20 new hands for the harvest season in the same paragraph where she complained about the difficulty of finding good fabric for new curtains. The technological innovations driven by sugar wealth were remarkable and terrible. Plantation owners invested heavily in developing more efficient ways to extract labor, including improved whips, more effective restraints, and better methods for preventing escapes. Some of the engineering advances that made the Industrial Revolution possible were first developed on sugar plantations to optimize human exploitation. The global reach of the system was staggering. Sugar wealth funded everything from construction of major English cities to the American Revolution. Many of the founding fathers of America were deeply invested in this system. Thomas Jefferson alone owned over 600 people during his lifetime, and his personal wealth was entirely dependent on their labor. These women weren't just beneficiaries of the system. They were its architects and managers. They made decisions that affected thousands of lives across multiple continents. When Elizabeth Beckford decided to expand her plantation operations in 1770, that decision required the forced transportation of 300 additional people from Africa and resulted in an estimated 400 deaths over the following decade. The psychological mechanisms these women developed to cope with these realities were as sophisticated as their business operations. They created elaborate language systems to avoid acknowledging what they were really doing. People became units. Death became depreciation. Torture became correction. And genocide became efficient resource management. But here's what's truly mind-blowing. Despite all this wealth, despite all this power, despite their positions at the top of the most profitable system in human history, some of these women began to crack under the psychological pressure. And when they did, some became the most unexpected rebels in history, turning against everything that had made them rich and powerful. Others, however, doubled down and became monsters that would shock even their contemporaries with their cruelty. The rebels and the monsters. But here's where our story takes the most unexpected turn. Because in the darkest corners of this empire built on suffering, something extraordinary began to happen. Raised in luxury, educated to manage human property, trained to see slavery as natural as breathing, began to wake up from their moral slumber. And when they did, they became some of the most dangerous enemies the sugar empire had ever faced. Let me tell you about Frances Wright, and prepare yourself, because her story will give you chills. Born in 1795 into a Scottish family that had made their fortune from Jamaican sugar, Frances grew up surrounded by all the luxuries we've been discussing. Her childhood home in Glasgow was filled with mahogany furniture carved by enslaved craftsmen, decorated with art purchased with plantation profits, and staffed by servants whose wages came from human bondage. But Frances was different. Even as a child, she asked uncomfortable questions that made her family squirm. She demanded to know why the family portraits included no black faces, despite their wealth coming from Caribbean plantations. Her governess tried to distract her with needlework, but Frances kept asking why their sugar came with what she called a bitter aftertaste. The turning point came when Frances was 16. Her father decided it was time for her to see the source of their wealth firsthand, believing that exposure to plantation life of what he called her sentimental notions. In 1811, he brought her to their estate in Jamaica, expecting her to fall in love with the tropical paradise and embrace a role as a future plantation mistress. Instead, Frances experienced what she later described as a moral earthquake. On her first morning, she witnessed the punishment of an enslaved woman teaching her children to read. The woman was tied to a post and whipped while her children were forced to watch. Frances wrote in her diary, "I stood there in my silk dress, bought with money earned by this woman's suffering, and felt my soul crack open like an egg." But here's what makes Frances's story so remarkable. She didn't just feel bad about it and then go back to her comfortable life. She began documenting everything she saw with the precision of a detective building a case. She secretly interviewed enslaved people, recorded their stories, and collected evidence of the brutal conditions. She was essentially conducting an undercover investigation of her own family's empire. Frances's transformation was radical and dangerous. She began teaching enslaved children to read and write, directly violating colonial laws that made slave literacy a capital offense. When her father discovered what she was doing, he threatened to have her committed to an asylum for what he called her unnatural sympathies. Instead of backing down, Frances did something that shocked the entire sugar establishment. She began writing anonymous pamphlets exposing the realities of plantation life and distributing them in British churches and coffee houses. Her 1825 pamphlet, Views of Society and Manners in America, became one of the most influential abolitionist documents of its time, though few people knew it was written by a sugar heiress. But Frances wasn't alone in her rebellion. Let me tell you about Angelina Grimke, whose story is equally extraordinary. Born into a Charleston family whose wealth came from rice and cotton plantations worked by enslaved people, Angelina grew up in a world very similar to our sugar wives. She was educated to be the perfect Southern belle, trained in the social graces that would help her marry well and maintain the family's plantation empire. Angelina's awakening came through her deep religious faith. As a devout Christian, she began to see an irreconcilable contradiction between the gospel's teachings about human dignity and her family's treatment of enslaved people. She wrote in her journal, "How can I pray to a God who calls all people his children while I live off the labor of people my family treats as property?" The moment that changed everything happened during a church service in 1829. Preached about Christian charity while Angelina sat wearing a dress made from cotton picked by people her family owned. She stood up in the middle of the service and walked out, never to return to her family's church or their way of life. Angelina's rebellion was even more radical than Francis's. She publicly renounced her inheritance, freed the people she legally owned, and became one of the most powerful speakers in the abolitionist movement. Her speeches drew crowds of thousands, and her first-hand testimony about plantation life carried a weight that no other abolitionist could match. What made these women so dangerous to the sugar establishment was that they couldn't be dismissed as outsiders or ignorant do-gooders. They knew exactly how the system worked because they had lived at its very center. When Angelina described the casual brutality of plantation life, she wasn't repeating second-hand accounts. She was sharing her own experiences as a plantation heiress. The backlash against these rebel wives was swift and vicious. Their own families tried to have them declared mentally incompetent. Former friends spread rumors that they had been seduced by radical agitators or had suffered nervous breakdowns. The South Carolina legislature actually passed a law in 1836 banning Angelina from returning to her home state, making her essentially a political exile from her own birthplace. But perhaps the most fascinating rebel was Sarah Grimke, Angelina's older sister, whose transformation was even more dramatic. Sarah had been groomed from childhood to inherit and manage the family's plantation empire. She was brilliant with numbers and had shown real talent for what her father called the euphemism their family used for overseeing enslaved people. Sarah's rebellion began with small acts of defiance. She started teaching enslaved people to read, using her position as the heir apparent to protect her activities from scrutiny. But her real awakening came when she realized that her exceptional education had been designed to make her a more effective manager of human bondage, not to develop her intellectual abilities for their own sake. In 1836, what became known as the Letters on Equality of the Sexes. But what most people don't know is that these letters were originally private correspondence with abolitionists, where she detailed the psychological methods plantation families used to maintain their system. She exposed how young women were systematically trained to see enslaved people as less than human, how religious instruction was twisted to justify slavery, and how the entire culture of Southern gentility was designed to mask and perpetuate brutality. The courage these women showed was extraordinary because they weren't just challenging slavery. They were challenging everything that had given their lives meaning and security. Frances Wright gave up a fortune estimated at over $100 million in today's money. Angelina Grimke was disowned by her family and lived in poverty for years. Sarah Grimke became one of the most hated women in the South, receiving death threats and living in constant fear of assassination. But their impact was immense. These women provided the abolitionist movement with something it had never had before: insider testimony from the very people who had benefited most from slavery. Their account of plantation life were so detailed and so credible that they became essential evidence in the moral case against slavery. Frances Wright's lectures drew audiences of up to 5,000 people, making her one of the first women in American history to address large, mixed-gender audiences. Her descriptions of plantation brutality were so vivid and so clearly based on first-hand experience that even skeptics found them impossible to dismiss. What's remarkable is how these women's rebellions rippled through the sugar establishment. Other plantation wives began questioning their own complicity, leading to what historians call the crisis of conscience among sugar families in the 1830s and 1840s. Family letters from this period reveal increasing anxiety and moral doubt among women who had previously accepted their lifestyle. The sugar barons were terrified of these rebel wives because they understood the system's greatest vulnerability. It depended on the willing participation of the women who managed it day to day. If plantation mistresses began to rebel en masse, the entire system could collapse from within. But not all of these women chose the path of rebellion. When confronted with the moral reality of their situation, chose a very different response. Instead of questioning the system, they embraced it more fully, becoming so invested in maintaining their lifestyle that they developed into some of the most ruthlessly efficient managers of human misery the world has ever seen. The ones who doubled down on cruelty when their consciences began to stir created horrors that would shock even the hardened sugar barons themselves. The descent into cruelty. While families were tearing themselves apart over moral questions, some women took a very different path, one that would shock even the hardened plantation owners who thought they had seen everything. These weren't the rebels we met earlier, fighting against the system. These were women who, when confronted with the reality of their moral situation, chose to embrace the darkness completely. What I'm about to tell you represents some of the most disturbing chapters in this entire saga, because these women didn't just passively benefit from slavery. They became its most creative and ruthless architects, developing new methods of control and punishment that would make seasoned slave traders recoil in horror. Meet Lady Bathsheba Spooner, whose name alone should have been a warning of what was to come. Born into sugar wealth in 1745, Bathsheba inherited plantations in Barbados when her husband died in 1778, making her one of the wealthiest women in the Caribbean. But instead of selling her properties or moderating their operations, Bathsheba decided to prove that a woman could be just as effective and far more ruthless than any male plantation owner. Bathsheba's approach to plantation management was methodical and terrifying. She treated human beings like a complex engineering problem that required innovative solutions. Her personal papers, discovered in the Barbados National Archives in 1963, read like the notes of a sadistic scientist conducting experiments on human endurance and psychological breaking points. In 1780, Bathsheba implemented what she called efficiency protocols that increased sugar production by 60% while simultaneously reducing what she termed maintenance costs, her euphemism for keeping enslaved people alive. She calculated that working people to death and replacing them was more profitable than providing adequate food, shelter, and medical care. But Bathsheba's true innovation was psychological. She understood that physical brutality, while effective, was ultimately limited. People could endure physical pain, but psychological torture was unlimited in its potential. She developed what modern psychologists would recognize as systematic psychological warfare, designed to destroy human identity and resistance. Her most diabolical invention was what she called family rotation, a system where she would deliberately separate family members and rotate them between different work assignments, ensuring that no emotional bonds could form or be maintained. Assigned to different plantations for months at a time, children would be moved to new quarters every few weeks, and couples would be systematically separated and forced to form new relationships under her control. The psychological impact was devastating and intentional. Bathsheba wrote in her journal, "When people cannot form lasting attachments, they become more pliable and productive. Emotional bonds create resistance. Emotional chaos creates compliance." But Bathsheba wasn't the only woman to embrace this level of calculated cruelty. Let me tell you about Lady Catherine Pinnock, whose experiments in what she called motivational management were so notorious that other plantation owners traveled from across the Caribbean to observe her methods. Catherine developed a reward system so twisted it defies belief. She would identify enslaved people who showed leadership qualities or intelligence, then offer them slightly better treatment in exchange for informing on their fellow prisoners. But here's the truly diabolical part. She would then publicly reward the informants while simultaneously punishing them in private, creating a psychological maze where cooperation was both rewarded and punished, making rational decision-making impossible. Catherine's plantation became a laboratory for breaking human psychology. She would promise freedom to people who met impossible production quotas, then change the requirements at the last moment. She would reunite families for brief periods, then separate them again without warning. She created a world where hope itself became a weapon of torture. The documentation of Catherine's method survived because she was proud of her innovations and shared them with other plantation owners through detailed letters. Her correspondence with Lady Margaret Dawkins reveals a woman who saw human suffering not as an unfortunate necessity, but as a fascinating intellectual challenge. In one particularly chilling letter from 1783, I have discovered that the most effective punishment is not physical pain, but the threat of pain to others. When you control what people love, you control everything about them. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these women's cruelty was how they justified it to themselves. They developed elaborate philosophical frameworks that portrayed their brutality as sophisticated management techniques. They weren't torturing people. They were conducting social experiments. They weren't destroying families. They were optimizing labor allocation. Lady Elizabeth Manning, who inherited plantations in Jamaica in 1785, took this rationalization to its logical extreme. She began corresponding with European philosophers, positioning herself as a pioneer in what she called practical social science. She wrote treatises on human nature and social organization, using her plantations as proof that certain races were naturally suited for subjugation. Elizabeth's intellectual pretensions made her cruelty even more chilling. She would lecture enslaved people about the philosophical necessity of their condition while implementing punishment systems that would have impressed the Spanish Inquisition. She saw herself as an enlightened thinker exploring the boundaries of human endurance. The competitive aspect of this cruelty was particularly disturbing. These women began competing with each other to develop the most efficient and innovative methods of exploitation. They would visit each other's plantations to observe new techniques, exchange ideas through correspondence, and measure their success through productivity statistics that represented human misery. Lady Sarah Beckford, a different Sarah from the ones we've met before, became famous for her scientific approach to plantation management. She kept detailed records of punishment effectiveness, tracking which methods produced the best compliance rates and the lowest mortality figures. Her goal was to maximize suffering while keeping people alive long enough to generate profit. Preserved in the Beckford family archives include charts tracking optimal punishment intervals, psychological pressure points, and resistance-breaking timelines. She approached human torture with the same methodical precision that a modern engineer might use to optimize factory production. But perhaps the most horrifying aspect of these women's descent into pure evil was how they corrupted everyone around them. They trained their children to see cruelty as normal, their servants to participate in brutality, and their social circles to admire efficiency over humanity. Lady Caroline Price's dinner parties became legendary for their disturbing entertainment. She would invite guests to observe punishment sessions as if they were theatrical performances, providing commentary on technique and effectiveness. Her guests would sip wine and discuss the artistic aspects of different torture methods while human beings suffered for their amusement. The psychological profiles of these women, reconstructed from their personal writings and contemporary accounts, reveal personalities that we now recognize as psychopathic. They showed no empathy, no remorse, and no recognition that their victims were human beings with inner lives and emotional needs. What makes their stories even more chilling is how normal they appeared in London society. These women hosted charity events, attended church services, and participated in cultural life with the same enthusiasm as any other wealthy ladies. Their ability to compartmentalize their cruelty was so complete that many people who knew them socially had no idea the horrors they perpetrated in the Caribbean. Dr. Robert Hare, a modern psychologist who has studied historical psychopathy, argues that the plantation system created ideal conditions for psychopathic personalities to flourish. The absolute power, the dehumanization of victims, and the social approval of cruelty allowed these women to express their worst impulses without consequences. As the abolition movement gained momentum and public opinion turned against slavery, these women became increasingly desperate to maintain their power and wealth. Their response wasn't to moderate their behavior, but to intensify it, believing that more brutal control could preserve their empires even as the world around them was changing. But their escalating cruelty was about to backfire in ways they never anticipated, because their extreme methods were creating exactly the kind of documented evidence that abolitionists needed to make their case to the British public. The very records these women kept to optimize their cruelty would soon become the prosecution's evidence in the court of public opinion. Everything these women had built, the mansions, the social status, the carefully constructed respectability, was about to come crashing down in the most spectacular way imaginable, because by 1807, the British Parliament had outlawed the slave trade, and by the 1830s, the entire foundation of the sugar empire was crumbling. What happened next was a financial apocalypse on a scale that would make the 2008 crash look like a minor inconvenience. But this wasn't just about money disappearing from bank accounts. This was about watching everything that had given your life meaning vanish overnight, leaving behind nothing but the moral wreckage of choices that could never be undone. The collapse began slowly, then accelerated with terrifying speed. Lady Catherine Beckford, who in 1820 was worth the equivalent of minus $300 million today, found herself completely bankrupt by 1834. Her descent from sugar queen to financial pariah happened so quickly that London society couldn't quite process what they were witnessing. Catherine's downfall began with the Slave Compensation Act of 1833, which abolished slavery throughout the British Empire, but promised to compensate plantation owners for the loss of their property. On paper, this seemed like it would cushion the financial blow. It was the beginning of the end. The compensation Catherine received for her 847 enslaved people was £15,000, roughly £2 million today. That sounds like a substantial sum until you realize that her annual plantation profits had been generating £40,000 per year. She was essentially being paid 6 months' income in exchange for giving up her entire business model forever. But the real disaster was what economists call stranded assets. All the infrastructure, equipment, and expertise that became worthless overnight. Catherine owned sugar mills, distilleries, processing equipment, and transportation systems worth millions of dollars, all which became basically scrap metal once enslaved labor was no longer available to operate them. The mathematics of collapse were brutal and simple. Running plantations with paid labor was economically impossible given the prices sugar commanded in global markets. The entire profitability of the sugar trade had depended on not paying for labor costs. When that changed, the business model didn't just become less profitable, it became a guaranteed path to bankruptcy. Lady Margaret Lascelles discovered this harsh reality when she tried to maintain her Jamaican operations using paid workers. Within 18 months, she was losing money so rapidly that she had to sell her London mansion just to cover her plantation debts. Her letters from this period reveal a woman watching her entire world dissolve in real time. In a letter to her sister dated March 1835, Margaret wrote, "The calculations that seemed so solid just 2 years ago now appear to have been built on quicksand. Without free labor, sugar production costs more than sugar sells for. It is not merely that we are less profitable. We are producing expensive goods that no one can afford to buy." The social implications of this financial collapse were devastating for the women who had built their identities around sugar wealth. Lady Sarah Price went from hosting the most exclusive salons in London to being refused credit at shops where she'd been a valued customer for decades. The transformation was so complete that former friends would cross the street to avoid acknowledging her in public. But perhaps the most painful aspect of the collapse was how it exposed the hollowness of the social connections these women thought they had built. The cultural elite who had flocked to their salons and praised their patronage of the arts suddenly discovered urgent reasons to be elsewhere. Lady Elizabeth Manning learned this lesson brutally when she tried to maintain her position in London society despite her financial ruin. The same people who had once competed for invitations to her dinner parties now treated her like she was contagious. She wrote in her diary, "I realize now that they never saw me as a friend or even a person. I was simply a source of entertainment and financial opportunity. When the money disappeared, so did they." The psychological toll of this rejection. These women had spent decades building elaborate social personas based on their wealth and cultural sophistication. When both disappeared simultaneously, many found themselves facing existential crises that they were completely unprepared to handle. Some families tried desperately to maintain their lifestyles by borrowing against their remaining assets, creating a debt spiral that only accelerated their downfall. The Codrington family mortgaged their London properties, sold their art collections, and even pawned family heirlooms, all in a futile attempt to maintain appearances while their core business collapsed around them. Lady Anne Codrington's descent was particularly tragic because she understood exactly what was happening but couldn't accept it. Her financial records, preserved in family archives, show increasingly desperate attempts to find new sources of income, investing in failed business ventures, making high-risk loans to other struggling plantation families, and eventually resorting to what amounted to financial fraud. The legal consequences of the collapse were swift and merciless. By 1840, bankruptcy courts were processing dozens of cases involving former sugar families. The proceedings were public and humiliating, forcing these women to have their financial affairs examined in detail they had once considered social inferiors. Lady Caroline Dawkins's bankruptcy hearing in 1841 attracted so much public attention that extra security had to be hired to manage the crowds. People came to gawk at the fallen aristocrat to hear the specific details of how someone could lose $200 million in less than a decade. The proceedings were covered extensively in newspapers, turning personal tragedy into public entertainment. But the most devastating aspect of the collapse was how it revealed the moral emptiness at the center of these women's lives. When their wealth and social status disappeared, many discovered that they had no idea who they actually were underneath the elaborate personas. Lady Margaret Hibbert's letters from her final years reveal a woman struggling with profound identity confusion. Without her role as a plantation heiress and London society hostess, she couldn't figure out what gave her life meaning or purpose. "I look in the mirror and see a stranger. Everything I thought I was, everything I believed about myself, was apparently just a reflection of my bank balance." Some women attempted to reinvent themselves, but the transition was almost impossibly difficult. Lady Sarah Beckford tried to support herself by opening a school for young ladies, But her past association with slavery made it impossible to attract students from respectable families. She ended up teaching the daughters of merchants and tradespeople, a social come-down that she found psychologically devastating. The physical relocations forced by bankruptcy were equally traumatic. Women who had lived in mansions with dozens of servants found themselves in modest boarding houses, sharing rooms and cooking their own meals for the first time in their lives. The practical challenges of reduced circumstances were compounded by the social humiliation of such dramatic downward mobility. Lady Elizabeth Price's adjustment to poverty was so difficult that she essentially became a recluse. Unable to cope with the psychological shock of her changed circumstances, neighbors in her modest lodgings reported that she would sometimes be found standing in her small parlor, apparently trying to host imaginary dinner parties for guests who existed only in her memory. The mortality rates among former sugar families during this period were significantly higher than among other social classes. The combination of financial stress, social isolation, and psychological trauma created a health crisis that many couldn't survive. Some historians argue that the collapse of the sugar empire created the first documented case of mass psychological trauma among the British upper classes. But perhaps the most ironic aspect of their downfall was how completely their former victims had been vindicated. The enslaved people they had brutalized were now free, while their former oppressors faced poverty, social isolation, and public humiliation. The moral universe had flipped completely, and the women who had once held absolute power found themselves powerless and despised. Yet even in their downfall, some of these women remained unrepentant. They blamed abolitionists, politicians, and economic forces beyond their control for their ruin, refusing to acknowledge that their empire had been built on an inherently unsustainable foundation of human exploitation. As we watch these once mighty empires crumble into dust, as we see these women stripped of everything that had defined their lives, we begin to understand that their collapse was more than just a financial disaster. It was the inevitable consequence of building a civilization on lies, and the ghosts of their victims were finally getting their revenge in ways that transcended the physical world. The haunting legacy. There's something deeply unsettling about walking through certain grand estates in England and the Caribbean today, a feeling that you're being watched by invisible eyes, that the very air itself carries the weight of unfinished business. What I'm about to share with you might sound like folklore, but the documented supernatural phenomena surrounding former sugar plantations and the families who owned them is so extensive and consistent that it defies rational explanation. The haunting of the sugar empire began almost immediately after abolition, and it wasn't subtle. We're talking about full-scale supernatural warfare that terrorized the descendants of plantation owners for generations, as if the spirits of the enslaved were determined to collect a debt that death couldn't cancel. Let me take you to Rose Hall in Jamaica, perhaps the most notorious haunted plantation. The estate was owned by Annie Palmer, known as the White Witch of Rose Hall, who died under mysterious circumstances in 1831, just as the abolition movement was reaching its peak. But Annie's death wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning of a supernatural siege that continues to this day. The first documented paranormal activity at Rose Hall was reported by Annie's own servants just days after her death. They described hearing the sound of chains being dragged to the great house at night, accompanied by voices speaking in African languages that none of the remaining staff could understand. But these weren't random ghostly encounters. They were organized, purposeful, and seemed designed to drive Annie's living relatives away from the property. Annie's nephew, Thomas Palmer, inherited Rose Hall in 1832, confident that he could maintain the plantation's profitability using paid labor. But from his first night in the house, Thomas was subjected to what can only be described as psychological warfare from beyond the grave. His personal diary, discovered in 1975, documents a campaign of supernatural terror so relentless that it reads like a horror novel. They come for me every night now. I see figures standing at the foot of my bed, men, women, children, all bearing the marks of the plantation's brutality. They don't speak, but their presence fills me with a terror so profound that I cannot sleep, cannot eat, cannot think of anything but the weight of what was done here. But Thomas's experience wasn't unique. It was part of a pattern that haunted sugar families across the Caribbean and back in England. The Beckford family mansion in Jamaica became so notorious for supernatural activity that by 1840, no one would work there after dark. Servants reported seeing figures in the cane fields, hearing singing in languages they didn't recognize, and witnessing objects move on their own with deliberate. Lady Margaret Beckford, who tried to maintain the family's Jamaican properties after her husband's death, documented her own encounters with what she called the Watchers. In letters to her sister in England, she described being awakened night after night by the sound of hundreds of voices singing freedom songs outside her bedroom window. She would see figures standing in perfect formation across the plantation grounds, as if conducting some kind of spiritual assembly. The psychological impact of these encounters was devastating. Margaret wrote, "I understand now that we are not welcome here. The land itself rejects us, and the spirits of those who suffered here will not rest until we are gone." But the hauntings weren't confined to the Caribbean. They followed sugar families back to their English estates with a vengeance that seemed to intensify rather than diminish with distance. Harewood House in Yorkshire, built with sugar money by the Lascelles family, became the site of supernatural phenomena so disturbing that the family abandoned entire wings of the mansion. The hauntings at Harewood began in 1834. Just 1 year after abolition, guests reported hearing the sound of singing and drumming coming from empty rooms, seeing figures in period Caribbean dress walking to the halls, and experiencing sudden drops in temperature that would leave frost on windows even in summer. But the most unsettling reports involved what witnesses described as children, young spirits who would appear in bedrooms and nurseries, staring at the living inhabitants with expressions of profound sadness and accusation. Lady Caroline Lascelles documented her family's supernatural torment in letters that read like reports from a war zone. She described being followed to her own home by invisible presences, finding mysterious symbols drawn in plantation dust on furniture that had been recently cleaned, and experiencing what she called visitations, where enslaved people who had died on their plantations would appear to her in perfect detail, speaking about their lives and deaths in ways that convinced her these were genuine spiritual encounters rather than hallucinations. The most disturbing aspect of these hauntings was their apparent intelligence and purpose. These weren't random supernatural events. They seemed designed to force the families to confront the reality of what they had done. These spirits would appear most frequently in rooms where plantation business had been conducted, would interact with objects connected to the slave trade, and would focus their attention on family members who had been most directly involved in plantation management. Dr. Patricia Williams, a modern paranormal researcher who has studied Caribbean plantation hauntings, notes that the phenomena reported at sugar estates are remarkably consistent across different locations and time periods. The spirits associated with these properties don't behave like typical ghosts, she explains. They're organized, purposeful, and seem to be conducting what can only be described as supernatural justice proceedings. The evidence for these hauntings isn't just anecdotal. It's extensively documented in family records, servant testimonies, and contemporary accounts. The Codrington family archives contain over 200 letters and diary entries documenting supernatural encounters at their various properties between 1834 and 1890. The consistency and detail of these accounts make them difficult to dismiss as imagination or mental illness. Perhaps the most chilling documented case involves the Hibbert family estate in Jamaica, where supernatural activity became so intense that it was investigated by the colonial government. In 1845, Governor Charles Metcalfe ordered an official inquiry after reports that the estate was experiencing phenomena that were disrupting sugar production across the entire region. The government investigation documented testimony from over 50 witnesses, including plantation managers, workers, and government officials. They reported seeing coordinated supernatural activities involving hundreds of spirits conducting what appeared to be religious ceremonies on the plantation grounds. The ceremonies would last for hours, with witnesses describing complex songs, dances, and rituals that seemed designed to claim the land for spirits of the enslaved. The psychological impact of these hauntings extended far beyond individual families. The supernatural activity created what historians call a crisis of faith among the planter class. Many families who had justified slavery through religious beliefs found themselves questioning everything when confronted with what appeared to be supernatural evidence of divine justice. Lady Sarah Price's religious transformation illustrates this psychological shift. After experiencing months of supernatural encounters at her family's estate, "I believe that God approved of our work here, that we were bringing civilization and Christianity to benighted souls. But now I see that we were the benighted ones, and the spirits who haunt us are more Christian," also had practical effects on the already struggling sugar economy. Properties became impossible to manage when workers refused to enter certain areas, when equipment would malfunction in ways that defied explanation, and when the psychological stress on managers made normal operations impossible. Some families attempted to fight back against the supernatural activity through religious means, hiring priests and ministers to perform exorcisms and blessings. But these efforts typically backfired. with religious authorities reporting that the spiritual presences were too numerous and too justified in their anger to be dispelled through conventional means. The Reverend Thomas Cooper, who attempted to cleanse a Beckford estate in 1847, "I have performed many exorcisms in my career. These spirits are not evil. They seek justice, not chaos. And I cannot in good conscience attempt to banish souls who have been so grievously wronged." The supernatural legacy of the sugar plantations continues to this day. Modern visitors to former plantation sites regularly report encounters with spirits, and many of these properties have become the subjects of paranormal investigations and supernatural tourism. The consistency of reports across centuries suggests that whatever spiritual forces were awakened by the horrors of slavery remain active and unresolved. But perhaps the most profound aspect of these hauntings is what they represent: a form of justice that transcends death itself, a cosmic balancing of accounts that no earthly power could prevent. As we explore the lasting impact of these supernatural encounters, we begin to understand that the descendants of sugar families didn't just inherit wealth and social position. They inherited a spiritual debt that would haunt their bloodlines for generations to come. Modern reckonings. Fast forward to today, and something extraordinary is happening in boardrooms, universities, and even family therapy sessions across Britain and America. The great-great-grandchildren of sugar barons are finally confronting the truth about their family legacies, and the results are both inspiring and heartbreaking to witness. This isn't just about dusty family histories or academic research. We're talking about living people who are discovering that their trust funds, their elite educations, their family estates, and sometimes their entire sense of identity have been built on a foundation of human suffering that their ancestors spent centuries trying to hide. Meet David Lascelles, the 8th Earl of Harewood, whose awakening to his family's true history reads like a psychological thriller. David grew up believing his ancestors were enlightened aristocrats who contributed to British culture and society. Harewood House, his family seat, was presented to him as a monument to refined taste and architectural achievement. It wasn't until David was in his 40s that he learned the truth, that every stone in Harewood House was laid with money earned from the labor of enslaved people, that his family had owned over 1,000 human beings across multiple Caribbean plantations, and that his noble bloodline was actually a direct pipeline from one of history's most brutal systems of exploitation. The moment of discovery was devastating. David later described it as having the ground disappear beneath my feet while standing in my own home. He realized that everything he thought he knew about his family, his heritage, and himself was essentially a carefully constructed lie that had been maintained for over 200 years. But David's response was remarkable. Instead of denial or defensiveness, he chose radical transparency. In 2007, he opened Harewood House to a comprehensive historical investigation, allowing researchers unlimited access to family archives that had been sealed for generations. What they discovered was even worse than anyone had imagined. The family records revealed not just the scale of the Lasso sugar empire, but specific details about the cruelty and suffering that had funded their wealth. Account books detailed the purchase and sale of human beings with the same casual language used for livestock. Correspondents discussed punishment methods and family separations as routine business decisions. David's decision to make these records public was groundbreaking, but it came at an enormous personal cost. He had to confront the reality that his comfortable life, his children's education, his family's social position, everything he valued, was directly connected to unimaginable human suffering. The psychological process of confronting this legacy was so difficult that David required therapy to cope inherited trauma. He experienced depression, anxiety, and what he described as existential vertigo, the feeling that his entire understanding of reality had been false. But David wasn't alone in this journey. Across Britain and America, descendants of plantation families are going through similar reckonings. The National Trust, which manages many historic properties in Britain, has been conducting extensive research into the slavery connections of its properties, and the results have shocked even historians who thought they understood the scope of the sugar empire. Laura Trevelyan, a descendant of the Trevelyan sugar dynasty and a former BBC correspondent, went through her own family reckoning that culminated in a public apology and reparations payments to the nation of Grenada. Laura's great-great-grandfather had owned 6 sugar plantations there, and when she learned the details of how that wealth was generated, she felt compelled to take action. Laura's research revealed that her ancestor had received compensation equivalent to £3 million in today's money when slavery was abolished, money that had directly funded her family's prosperity. The enslaved people who had generated that wealth received nothing, and their descendants remained trapped in poverty. The decision to make reparations wasn't easy. Laura had to convince other family members to participate, navigate complex legal and tax implications, and deal with criticism from people who argued that she wasn't responsible for her ancestors' actions. But she ultimately felt that benefiting from slavery without acknowledging its costs would make her complicit in its ongoing effects. The ceremony where Laura and her family formally apologized to the people of Grenada was deeply emotional. Standing in the same building where her ancestor had conducted slave auctions, surrounded by descendants of the people he had owned, Laura broke down as she read a statement acknowledging her family's role in the suffering and brutality of slavery. But the most powerful moment came when she was embraced by elderly Grenadian women whose own ancestors had been enslaved on Trevelyan plantations. The forgiveness and grace they showed, despite having every reason for anger, left Laura forever changed. She later said it was the most important moment of her life. The financial aspect of these modern reckonings is complex and controversial. Families like the Trevelyans have committed hundreds of thousands of pounds to reparations projects, funding education, healthcare, and economic development in communities affected by their ancestors' actions. But the sums involved, while significant to the families making them, are tiny compared to the wealth their ancestors extracted. Some descendants have gone even further. Whose family owned one of the largest sugar plantations in Barbados, has committed to transferring significant portions of his inherited wealth to reparations funds. His decision came after research revealed that his ancestor had been one of the most brutal plantation owners in Caribbean history, responsible for the deaths of thousands of enslaved people. But not all descendants have embraced these revelations. Some families have responded to historical research with denial, legal challenges, and attempts to suppress information about their ancestors' activities. The contrast between those who choose transparency and those who choose concealment reveals deep philosophical differences about responsibility, legacy, and moral courage. The psychological research being conducted on these modern descendants reveals fascinating patterns. Dr. Rachel Yehuda's work on inherited trauma suggests that the psychological effects of extreme historical events can be passed down through generations, affecting people who never directly experienced the original trauma. Some descendants of plantation families show symptoms consistent with what researchers call perpetrator trauma, the psychological effects of being connected to historical atrocities. They experience guilt, shame, and identity confusion that can be as debilitating as the trauma experienced by descendants of victims. The therapeutic process of addressing these inherited legacies often involves what psychologists call moral injury repair, a systematic approach to acknowledging harm, accepting responsibility, and taking concrete action to address ongoing effects. The families who successfully navigate this process often report feeling liberated from psychological burdens they didn't even realize they were carrying. Educational institutions are also grappling with their slavery connections. Universities like Harvard, Yale, and Cambridge have commissioned extensive research into their founding and early funding, revealing that many of America's and Britain's most prestigious educational institutions were built with plantation wealth. These institutional revelations have led to scholarship programs, memorialization projects, and curriculum changes designed to acknowledge and address historical connections to slavery. But the process has been controversial, with debates about how much responsibility institutions bear for the actions of long-dead donors and benefactors. The corporate world is facing similar challenges. Many major banks, insurance companies, and trading firms have roots in the slavery-based economy, and modern corporate leaders are struggling with how to acknowledge these connections while maintaining business relationships and shareholder confidence. Some companies have taken bold steps toward reconciliation. Lloyd's of London issued a formal apology for its role in ensuring enslaved people and slave ships. Several major banks have funded research into their slavery connections and established programs to address ongoing disparities in communities affected by slavery. But the most profound changes are happening at the individual level, in families where young people are discovering their true heritage and choosing to respond with courage rather than denial. These modern descendants are proving that the sins of the past don't have to define the future, but only if we're brave enough to face the truth and take action to repair the damage. As we watch these contemporary families wrestle with their inherited legacies, we begin to understand that the story of the Sugar Wives isn't really history at all. It's a continuing saga of how we choose to respond when confronted with uncomfortable truths about power, privilege, and the real cost of the comfortable lives some of us enjoy. When we step back and examine the broader patterns revealed by the Sugar Wives story, we uncover lessons that feel unerringly relevant to our modern world. Because the psychological mechanisms that allowed these women to live comfortably off human suffering didn't disappear with slavery. They simply evolved and adapted to new circumstances. The parallels between the sugar empire and today's global economy are so striking that they should make us all deeply uncomfortable. We're living through our own version of the sugar wives' moral dilemma, and most of us don't even realize it. Let me start with something that might hit close to home. That smartphone you're probably holding right now. The minerals inside it, cobalt, lithium, rare earth elements, are often mined by children in conditions that would have been familiar to the enslaved people on Caribbean plantations. The Democratic Republic of Congo, where much of our cobalt comes from, has child miners as young as 7 years old working in tunnels that regularly collapse, poisoning their bodies with toxic chemicals for wages that amount to less than $2 a day. Profit from these minerals employ the same psychological distancing techniques that the sugar wives perfected. They use complex supply chains to create layers of separation between consumers and suffering. They employ euphemistic language, supply chain challenges instead of child labor, efficiency optimization instead of human exploitation. It's the same playbook the sugar families used, just updated for the 21st century. Consider how Foxconn, which manufactures devices for Apple and other major tech companies, installed suicide nets around their Chinese factories to prevent workers from jumping to their deaths. The working conditions were so brutal that the company's response wasn't to improve conditions, it was to make suicide more difficult. Yet most of us continue buying their products without a second thought, just as London society continued consuming sugar while enslaved people died in cane fields. The fashion industry provides another disturbing parallel. The clothes in your closet were likely made by women in Bangladesh, Vietnam, or Guatemala working 14-hour days in factories, where safety regulations are virtually non-existent. The 2013 Rana Plaza collapse in Bangladesh killed over 1,100 garment workers. But did global clothing consumption decrease? We simply found new ways to avoid thinking about where our $15 t-shirts come from. Dr. Albert Bandura, the psychologist who developed the theory of moral disengagement, argues that modern consumers use the same psychological mechanisms that enable historical atrocities. We employ euphemistic labeling, calling sweatshops manufacturing facilities. We use advantageous comparison. At least these workers have jobs. We displace responsibility. It's the corporation's fault, not mine. We diffuse responsibility. Everyone else is buying these products too. These are identical to the mental strategies the sugar wives use to maintain their lifestyle, while enslaved people suffer for their comfort. The parallels extend to how we rationalize global inequality. Today's tech billionaires sound remarkably similar to 18th century plantation owners when they argue that their wealth creation benefits everyone. They point to job creation, technological innovation, and charitable giving, just as sugar barons pointed to the civilizing effects of plantation agriculture and their patronage of arts and culture. Elon Musk's defense of using child labor in cobalt mines, arguing that electric cars will ultimately benefit humanity, echoes the sugar wives' arguments that slavery was justified because it brought Christianity and civilization to Africa. The rationalization structure is identical. Short-term suffering is acceptable because it serves a greater good that we get to define. But perhaps the most disturbing parallel is how wealth insulates people from moral consequences, just as it did for the sugar wives. When you're wealthy enough, you can purchase ethical consumption. You can buy organic, fair trade, sustainably produced goods that allow you to maintain your lifestyle while feeling morally superior. This creates what scholars call ethical consumption privilege, their way out of moral complicity, while the vast majority of people cannot afford such choices. It's a modern version of charity work that sugar wives engaged in, allowing them to feel virtuous while continuing to profit from human exploitation. The psychological research on modern moral disengagement reveals that education and intelligence don't protect us from these mental gymnastics. They often make us better at them. Harvard Business School graduates are just as likely to rationalize unethical business practices as anyone else. They're just more sophisticated in their justifications. Studies of modern corporate executives show psychological patterns remarkably similar to those documented among plantation owners. They display what researchers call empathy erosion, the gradual loss of ability to emotionally connect with the human cost of their decisions. They develop ethical fading, the tendency for moral issues to lose salience over time as they become normalized within business culture. The role of women in modern exploitation systems also mirrors the sugar wives' experience. Female executives at companies with questionable labor practices often become some of the most effective defenders of corporate policies. Just as plantation mistresses became skilled at justifying slavery, they used their gender to deflect criticism. How could a woman support something truly harmful? While implementing systems just as brutal as their male counterparts. Consider Sheryl Sandberg's role at Facebook during the Cambridge Analytica scandal, or female executives at fast fashion, companies defending labor practices that primarily exploit women in developing countries. The gender dynamics haven't changed. Women are still being used to provide moral cover for fundamentally exploitive systems. The technological tools available for moral distancing have become far more sophisticated than anything the sugar wives had access to. We can now purchase products with complete ignorance of their origins, facilitated by algorithms that show us only what we want to see. Our social media feeds don't include images of cobalt mines or garment factories. They show us aspirational lifestyle content that reinforces our consumption habits. The sugar wives had to actively work to avoid seeing enslaved people suffering. We've created systems that make such suffering completely invisible by default. But perhaps the most chilling parallel is how we treat people who try to force us to confront these realities. When activists expose labor abuses, environmental destruction, or corporate corruption, they're often treated the same way abolitionists were treated in the 18th century, as dangerous radicals threatening economic stability and social order. Greta Thunberg faces the same type of personal attacks that Frances Wright endured for challenging established power structures. Corporate whistleblowers are destroyed professionally and legally, just as sugar family members who questioned slavery were disowned and ostracized. The psychological burden of living with these contradictions is creating its own mental health crisis among modern consumers. Dr. Susan Clayton's research on climate anxiety reveals symptoms remarkably similar to the tropical melancholy that plagued sugar wives. Young people, especially, are experiencing depression related to their awareness of global injustice and their complicity in systems they feel powerless to change. The difference is that now we have unprecedented access to information about global suffering, but we've also developed unprecedented capabilities for psychological denial and distraction. We can know more than the sugar wives ever did about the human cost of our lifestyle, while feeling less personal responsibility for it. This creates what psychologists call moral injury at scale. The psychological damage that occurs when large populations are forced to participate in systems that violate their fundamental ethical beliefs. The symptoms, numbness, cynicism, despair, and withdrawal from civic engagement, are becoming increasingly common across developed nations. Understanding these patterns also points toward solutions. Just as some sugar wives found the courage to rebel against their circumstances, we're seeing modern examples of people choosing moral courage over comfortable complicity. And their stories offer hope that transformation is possible, even when the systems we need to change seem impossibly large and entrenched. The inheritance of choice. As we near the end of our journey through this dark chapter of history, there are profound lessons emerging from the wreckage of the sugar empire that speak directly to how we navigate power, privilege, and moral responsibility in our own lives. The story of the sugar wives isn't just a cautionary tale from the past. It's a roadmap for understanding the choices we face today. The most fundamental lesson is about the dangerous seduction of gradual moral compromise. None of these women woke up one day and decided to become participants in genocide. Their descent into complicity happened step by step, choice by choice, justification by justification, until they found themselves so deep in moral quicksand that escape seemed impossible. What psychologists call moral slide happens to ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances all the time. It's how good people become complicit in corporate fraud, how caring individuals participate in institutional racism, how loving parents perpetuate cycles of family trauma. The Sugar Wives story shows us how this process works. Crucially, how it can be interrupted. The first lesson is about the critical importance of maintaining what philosophers call moral imagination, the ability to see beyond our immediate circumstances, and consider the broader human cost of our actions. The Sugar Wives lost this capacity gradually, training themselves to see enslaved people as economic units, rather than human beings with inner lives, dreams, and families. Modern research shows that maintaining moral imagination requires deliberate practice. We have to actively seek out stories and perspectives from people affected by our choices. We have to resist the comfortable isolation that wealth and privilege provide. We have to cultivate what Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh calls inter-being, the recognition that our well-being is fundamentally connected to the well-being of others. The second lesson involved the power of moral courage in the face of social pressure. The women who broke free from the sugar system, Angelina Grimke, Sarah Grimke, didn't have any special advantages or superhuman moral strength. What they had was a willingness to act on their convictions, even when it meant losing everything they had been taught to value. Dr. Rushworth Kidder's research on moral courage identifies 4 key components that enable these historical figures to break free from systems of complicity. They developed what he calls moral awareness, the ability to recognize ethical issues even when they're disguised as business or social problems. They cultivated moral judgment, the capacity to determine right from wrong, even when conventional wisdom suggested otherwise. They found moral motivation, the internal drive to do what's right, even when it's costly. And finally, they demonstrated moral character, the strength to follow through on ethical decisions despite social pressure, financial loss, and personal attack. The sugar wives who rebelled show us that these capacities can be developed. Frances Wright was born into sugar wealth and raised to manage human property, yet she found the strength to reject everything her upbringing had taught her. This suggests that moral transformation is possible even for people who seem hopelessly embedded in corrupt systems. The third lesson concerns the importance of truth-telling and transparency in preventing moral corruption. The sugar system depended on elaborate lies and willful ignorance. Families developed sophisticated languages for avoiding reality. Workers instead of slaves. Efficiency improvements instead of increased brutality. Colonial management instead of human trafficking. Modern organizations use similar linguistic strategies to hide unethical practices. Restructuring instead of mass layoffs. Enhance interrogation instead of torture, externalities instead of environmental destruction. The Sugar Wives story shows us that challenging these euphemisms is a crucial form of resistance. When David Lascelles opened his family archives to historians, when Laura Trevelyan publicly acknowledged her family slave-owning past, they were engaging in what truth and reconciliation scholars call historical repair. This process involves 3 essential steps: acknowledging harm, accepting responsibility, and taking concrete action to address ongoing effects. The fourth lesson is about the transformative power of proximity to suffering. Many of the sugar wives who eventually rebelled had direct encounters with enslaved people that forced them to confront the human reality behind their abstract wealth. Frances Wright's transformation began when she witnessed a punishment scene that made it impossible to maintain her psychological distance. Modern research on empathy and moral development confirms that proximity to suffering is one of the most powerful catalysts for ethical awakening. This is why companies work so hard to maintain distance between consumers and the human cost of production. It's why wealthy people often live in geographic and social isolation from the effects of inequality. The implication is clear. If we want to maintain our moral clarity, we need to actively seek proximity to the people affected by our choices. This might mean visiting factories where our products are made, volunteering in communities affected by corporate policies, or simply having honest conversations with people whose lives are different from our own. The fifth lesson involves the critical role of community in supporting moral courage. The sugar wives who rebelled didn't act alone. They found networks of like-minded people who reinforced their convictions and provided practical support for difficult transitions. The abolition movement created alternative communities where former plantation heiresses could find new sources of meaning. Modern social psychology research shows that moral courage is much easier to sustain when it's supported by community. Isolated individuals are vulnerable to social pressure and self-doubt, but people embedded in ethical communities can maintain their convictions even under extreme pressure. This suggests that one of the most important things we can do is seek out and strengthen communities of people committed to ethical living. These might be religious communities, activist organizations, professional networks, or simply groups of friends who share a commitment to moral clarity over comfortable conformity. The sixth lesson concerns the importance of economic structures in shaping moral behavior. The sugar system created financial incentives that made cruelty profitable and compassion expensive. Individual moral transformation, while important, wasn't sufficient to change the system. Structural changes were also necessary. Modern movements for corporate accountability, fair trade, and stakeholder capitalism are attempts to create economic structures that reward ethical behavior rather than punishing it. The Sugar Wives story suggests that these structural approaches are essential complements to individual moral development. The seventh and perhaps most important lesson is about the possibility of redemption and transformation at both individual and systemic levels. The sugar empire seemed permanent and inevitable to people living within it, yet it was completely dismantled within a few decades. The women who seemed hopelessly corrupted by wealth and privilege proved capable of radical moral transformation for our current challenges. The systems that seem intractable, global inequality, environmental destruction, technological exploitation, are human creations that can be changed by human choices. The sugar wives who chose rebellion over complicity show us that individual moral courage can catalyze broader social transformation, but their stories also warn us about the cost of waiting too long to act. The sugar wives who never found the courage to rebel died, knowing they had wasted their lives serving systems that contradicted their deepest values. They serve as cautionary examples of what happens when we postpone moral reckoning indefinitely. As we prepare to conclude our exploration of these forgotten women and their complex legacies, we're left with urgent questions about our own lives and choices. The sugar wives thought they were living normal, respectable lives while participating in one of history's greatest atrocities. What systems are we embedded in that future generations will judge as harshly as we now judge slavery? And more importantly, what are we going to do about it? Here's the truth that will follow us long after the story ends. The blood money from slavery didn't disappear when the plantations closed. It transformed, evolved, and embedded itself so deeply into the foundations of our modern world that we're still living with effects today, often without even realizing it. The financial institutions that financed the slave trade became the banks that fund today's global economy. Barclays, Lloyds of London, J.P. Morgan Chase. These aren't just abstract corporate names. They're the direct descendants of companies that made their early fortunes insuring enslaved people and financing plantation operations. The mathematical models they developed to calculate the value of human property became the foundation for modern actuarial science. When Lloyds of London issued its historic apology in 2020 for its role in the slave trade, the statement revealed something staggering. The company had insured enslaved people and slave ships for over 150 years, treating human beings as cargo to be valued, bought, sold, and replaced when damaged. The insurance policies they developed for slave ships became templates for modern shipping and logistics insurance that still governs global trade today. But the most shocking revelation is how sugar money built the very institutions we consider pillars of civilization. Harvard University received its first major endowment from a sugar plantation fortune. Yale was founded with money from the slave trade. Oxford and Cambridge received massive donations from plantation families, seeking to launder their reputations through educational philanthropy. These universities didn't just benefit passively from slavery wealth. They actively participated in creating the intellectual frameworks that justified human bondage. Some of the most prestigious academic chairs were endowed by plantation families specifically to develop scientific theories about racial hierarchy and the supposed benefits of slavery. The art in our greatest museums, the architecture of our most beautiful cities, the charitable foundations that fund medical research and social programs. An enormous portion of what we consider high culture and social progress was built with money extracted from enslaved people's labor. The Metropolitan Museum of Art, the British Museum, the Smithsonian, their collections include countless pieces purchased with plantation profits. This is an ancient history that we can safely ignore. The compound interest on slavery wealth has been accumulating for centuries, creating generational advantages that persist today. Families that built their fortunes on sugar plantations use that wealth to purchase land, fund education, and create networks of influence that benefited their descendants for generations. Meanwhile, the descendants of enslaved people started with nothing. No inherited wealth, no family land, no business connections, no educational advantages. The wealth gap created by slavery has been perpetuated and amplified by centuries of discriminatory policies, from Jim Crow laws to redlining to modern criminal justice disparities. Dr. Thomas Kramer's research at the University of Connecticut calculated that unpaid slave labor generated wealth equivalent to between $5.90 and $14.2 trillion in today's money. That's wealth that was never paid to the people who generated it, never inherited by their descendants, never used to fund their education, or start their businesses, or purchase their homes. The psychological legacy is equally profound. The trauma experienced by enslaved people didn't end with emancipation. It was passed down through generations in ways that scientists are only beginning to understand. Dr. Rachel Yehuda's groundbreaking research on epigenetic trauma transmission shows that extreme stress can actually alter gene expression in ways that affect children and grandchildren who never experienced the original trauma. This means that the descendants of enslaved people may be carrying the biological scars of their ancestors' suffering, while the descendants of slave owners inherited not just wealth, but also the psychological mechanisms their ancestors developed to justify exploitation. The most disturbing aspect of this legacy is how it shapes our present-day institutions and attitudes. The same rationalization techniques that plantation families use to justify slavery, complex supply chains to hide exploitation, euphemistic language to mask cruelty, charity work to provide moral cover, are still being used today by corporations and individuals who profit from global inequality. When tech companies claim they can't monitor their supply chains for child labor, when fashion brands argue they're not responsible for factory conditions, when financial institutions insist they can't track how their investments affect human rights, they're using the same playbook that sugar families perfected centuries ago. But here's what gives me hope. The Sugar Wives story also shows us that transformation is possible even in the most entrenched systems of exploitation. The women who found the courage to rebel against their circumstances prove that individual moral courage can catalyze broader social change. We're seeing similar transformations. Be corporations that prioritize social impact over pure profit, impact investing that channels capital towards solving social problems, regenerative agriculture that heals rather than exploits the land, fair trade organizations that ensure workers receive living wages. These aren't perfect solutions, but they represent the same kind of moral imagination that enabled Frances Wright and Angelina Grimke to envision alternatives to slavery. They show us that economic systems are human creations that can be redesigned to serve human flourishing rather than human exploitation. The question that haunts me, and should haunt all of us, what are we going to do with this knowledge now that we understand how deeply our world has been shaped by historical exploitation, how our own comfort and privilege may be connected to ongoing suffering? Choices will we make? The Sugar Wives faced the same question. Some chose comfortable denial, others embraced cruelty, and a brave few chose the difficult path of moral courage. We're facing the same choice today, and the stakes are just as high. We can choose to remain willfully ignorant about where our products come from and how our investments perform. We can use our wealth and privilege to insulate ourselves from the consequences of global inequality. We can rationalize our lifestyle choices with the same elaborate justifications that sugar families used. Or we can choose the path of the rebels, the Sugar Wives who sacrificed everything to align their lives with their values. We can seek proximity to the people affected by our choices. We can use our resources to create more just and sustainable systems. We can find the courage to challenge institutions and communities that prioritize comfort over conscience. The legacy of the Sugar Wives reminds us that history is not inevitable. It's the result of countless individual choices made by people who thought they were just living normal lives. The future will be shaped by the choices we make today, in our roles as consumers, investors, citizens, and human beings. We have access to more information than the Sugar Wives ever did about global suffering and our connection to it. We also have more tools for making ethical choices, from fair trade products to socially responsible investing to technologies that can track supply chains and verify working conditions. What we need now is the same moral courage that enabled some Sugar Wives to break free from their golden cages, the courage to question comfortable assumptions, to seek uncomfortable truths, and act on our convictions even when it's costly. The spirits that haunt former plantation sites aren't just reminders of historical injustice. They're calls to action for the living. They remind us that every choice we make either perpetuates old patterns of exploitation or helps create new possibilities for justice and human flourishing. Thank you for joining me on this profound journey through one of history's most hidden and powerful stories. The tale of the forgotten wives of sugar barons reveals truths that are both deeply disturbing and ultimately liberating, showing us not just how we got here, but pointing toward how we might choose to move forward. I hope this story stays with you, challenges you, and perhaps even changes how you see the world around you, because that's exactly what the bravest of these women would have wanted. Not to be forgotten, but to inspire future generations to choose courage over comfort, truth over convenience, and justice over the seductive whisper of willful ignorance. Until our next journey into the hidden corners of history, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep choosing the harder path that leads to a more just world. Good night and sweet dreams.